One of the purposes of this series, which we hope will build up over coming weeks, is to have a lot of discussion. And so I'm going to speak for a while, but then I really hope that people will raise all sorts of questions and issues which are on their minds, because obviously we're going through a really fascinating, very, very complex period of changes in the region, about which I know a number of us here are really rather well informed. To kick off, let me just say that, of course, the events of January and February in this year affected the whole region, particularly the Arab region, but other countries in the Middle East have also been deeply affected. And that these events have been intimately, of course, associated with the current world crisis of capitalism, but they're also very closely associated with decades of complex developments in the Middle East itself, and of regional and also global political changes which have themselves deeply affected working class movements and the left. So this type of regional and global complexity to the events. Now, I personally first became directly engaged with this region when I visited Egypt in 1976, and I had experiences there which I think in a sense I can say I've never really recovered from. You know, people's first visit to Cairo was often, you know, quite memorable. I went in 1976, and it was a time when other sorts of global developments were impacting on that particular country. 1974, a couple of years earlier, was the year in which the then president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, introduced something called the Infitah, usually translated into English as the opening, or sometimes the open door. And this was the first major measure of marketization, so-called liberalization of a significant economy in the global south. He was the architect of the turn of Egypt from this state-centered economic model, and indeed political-centered model, towards the idea of the market. And so he took on board the ideas of what we call neoliberalism at a very, very early stage. And so this was 74. I was there a couple of years later. But already the impact of the Infitah was profound. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptian peasants had started to leave the land and were heading for the big cities, of course, principally Cairo and Alexandria. There was very rapidly growing unemployment, inflation, a type of sense of social dislocation. And there was a process of immiseration already, a sort of pauperization, the more vulnerable sections of the population already underway. It was very, very striking. So people who've been to Cairo, well, you know, and there's a few people in this room, will know that it's a quite rather startling, huge global city. But at that moment, it was also really a city in ferment, a city in high tension. There were mass struggles taking place, mass industrial struggles while I was there. There was a citywide bus strike, for example, I can remember very clearly. There was a great deal of bitterness and anger in relation to the Sadat regime. And I had the odd experience of standing in the street just north of Tahrir on one day when all the traffic was brought to a halt. And I wondered, what's going on here? Troops suddenly appeared, stopped traffic, pushed people back from the pavements. And then there was a pause, and eventually a series of vehicles came down the road, and in one of them was the president himself, Sadat himself, done up in a military uniform with loads of medals and gold and all the usual things that these guys have on them. Looked a bit of a cartoon character, really. And he was waving to the crowds, and I remember so clearly, he was greeted with complete silence. And as he progressed up the street, and as people saw who was coming, very large numbers of them turned their backs. And it was so, eloquent of the way, of what was going on in the society. But there was a sense of the society sort of in turmoil, yet at that moment people clearly did not feel empowered to take the initiative against the regime. They turned their backs in a sort of demonstrative way. 3 months later came the food riots. I was there in whatever it was, September, October 1976. In January 1977, there were the food riots, which were a mass movement of enormous power. They called it food riots. It was a mass popular protest against the demands of the IMF to cut food subsidies. So it's a very early response to this early imposition of neoliberal policies. And after all, Sadat was the pioneer of what we in Britain later called Thatcherism, or what was called Reaganomics in the US. I mean, the Egyptians were there first, interestingly. People weren't able to respond in the way that they responded over the last year. There were these riots. The army did come in. On this occasion, the army did take on the movement of the streets and did crush it with great brutality. Many thousands of people were killed, and of course Sadat and then Mubarak went on to consolidate the authoritarian state. So I had that experience in 1976, and since then, after living in Cairo, and then I guess visiting there countless times, under the Mubarak regime, I've been waiting like millions, tens of millions of Egyptians to settle with the dictatorship, and I've been waiting for that moment to arrive. And one of the strangest things for me was watching Al Jazeera, like I expect probably most of the people in this room were doing, in late January and early February this year, or maybe some of you, well, I know there's one person who was a participant in Syria during those events. But watching the Al Jazeera coverage, I could see the bitterest battles, particularly on February the 2nd, when the Baltagaya, the gangs were brought in to assault the activists from the street. Those battles took place at exactly the point, and everyone will know where this is, just north of Tahrir as you come up to the bridge there, exactly the point where I'd seen Sadat pass by 35 years earlier. And questions were coming to my mind as I was watching all this, of type of awe at what was going on, of course, and delight at the possibility, the potential of the movement. But also I was asking myself, why did it take so long under these successive regimes? And when it came, why was the fall of the dictatorship, the personal dictatorship of Mubarak, so rapid? Why did the revolutionary movement then spread and inspire movements in countries, Arab countries across the region, but not bring similar results, of course? I mean, we're all asking ourselves these questions in places like Syria and Yemen and Jordan and the countries of the Maghreb. And then asking, what's the dynamic of the revolutions, of course, first in Tunisia and then in Egypt, and how to ensure that they're not derailed or even suppressed. And here, of course, I think, again, probably most of us in the room are following the local and international press, the coverage of the developments in Egypt, which are extremely complex, I think in Egypt particularly at the moment, because there's a great deal of anxiety and talk in Egypt about the military regime attempting in various ways, probably rather incoherent ways, but attempting in various ways to prepare for the possibility of the suppression of the movement, to prepare for the possibility of counter-revolution. And this is being discussed and debated, amongst people in the streets, activists and so on, but also being examined very seriously by political strategists and others abroad. I mean, just this year, for the first time ever, I've become quite a devoted reader of Foreign Affairs, which is the American sort of State Department House journal, sort of mock academic journal. And they've had a whole series of articles about Egypt. In the latest one, they deal with both the Muslim Brotherhood and the likelihood of the military in Egypt handing over power, and examine it in their own sort of particular, with their own particular take. But what they're really talking about is whether or not the military is able to launch an effective counter-revolution. There's a great deal of discussion about this going on in Egypt at the moment. Now, I'm not wanting to raise the proposition here that that is going to happen, because I think we're very far from that situation. But these matters are in play. They're crucial issues. And certainly what happens in Tunisia, and especially in Egypt, is going to have an enormous influence on the trajectory of movements elsewhere in the region. So perhaps our most important purpose in having this series over coming weeks, and at the end we'll come to, to talk about some of these forthcoming meetings, we want to consider some of these matters. Now, of course, in order to do this, we're mobilising the insights of the Marxist tradition. And over these meetings, we want to think both historically and comparatively about these sorts of issues I've mentioned, especially about events over the last 100 years in the Middle East. And I talk about the Middle East broadly here, really everything from Morocco in the west to Iran in the east, and everything up and down in between. Think historically and comparatively across the different experiences in these countries. I'm pretty confident that our speakers will be making certain propositions which will be familiar to some of you, but not necessarily all of you. All these will be open to debate, of course, but propositions are roughly along the following sorts of lines: that radical alternatives to the regimes and radical alternatives to capitalism require far-reaching revolutionary change. And that means the further extension of the movements that we see underway in the region now. But what we might call social revolution, and we can come on to discuss what that means, requires an end to the old order, including, critically, the structures of state power. And that workers' struggles for these sorts of changes, and one of the most important things about particularly Tunisia and the Egyptian revolution is the centrality of involvement of the working classes in these movements. That workers' struggles for these sorts of change are in the interests of the whole society, of the wider society. Now, there are a whole series of other propositions that we can make, and I think these are absolutely crucial for our purposes. Now, I think it's right to say that for many years these sorts of ideas have been regarded as, by certain sorts of folks, as rather cranky. And talk of revolution as naive or worse. This is particularly true in the academic environment. Anyway, we're sitting in SOAS after all. I also work in a university, and I can't count the number of times in the last, say, 20 years that I've been told by academic colleagues that stuff about revolution is dinosaur politics, was a phrase that people used to use a great deal. But of course, not quite so much over the course of recent months. And not least, not only because of the power of the demonstrable power of the movements in the Middle East right now, but also because movements with at least incipient revolutionary aims are globalising, they're internationalising. And of course, I mean, there could hardly be a better time than this week to be talking about the impact of these revolutions in the mood worldwide, because on Saturday there were marches or occupations against corporate greed, many of them specifically against capitalism, world capitalism, in over 80 countries. I mean, you've also probably been following this. The media coverage has been quite fascinating. The one that took my eye were the banners in Sarajevo, in Bosnia. I mean, a country and a city which has undergone the most horrendous experiences over the course of the last 20 years or so. And there were a whole number of people with banners declaring death to capitalism, freedom to the people. Now, out of that turmoil and horror has come a type of hope for something different, which is clearly inspired by the movements internationally, and particularly in the Middle East. And many activists worldwide clearly recognise explicitly the inspiration of the Arab Spring. Absolutely clear. Especially the events of Tahrir, of course, in Cairo. I think that the word tahrir, of course, specific meaning in Arabic, it's a word like that most, or many of us weren't familiar with, like intifada, until, say, maybe 20 years ago. Intifada has type of entered English, in a way. Certainly, it's certain political discourses it has. And so tahrir, not so much in its specific Arabic meaning, but as a means of identifying revolution, defiance, victory. So this is a term now used worldwide. And just a little note here. An account of the events in London, headline, in Occupy London protest, echoes of Cairo. A street sign is reporting the events outside St Paul's and so on Saturday. A street sign that renamed the area Tahrir Square was erected early in the day, a banner declaring the IMF is our global Mubarak. Now, the important thing about this is that this appears in today's edition of the Egyptian newspaper, Al-Masri Al-Yawm. So there's the reference back and forth between Egypt and the site of the inspiration of this and the other activities, and so something really, really significant is going on here. Not merely people's fury over millions of us being made to pay the price of the capitalist crisis, but identification with the means of fighting back and bringing change. So these are profoundly significant developments. I mean, I was saying, you know, the jibes about dinosaur politics and so on and so forth have been going for a long time. Maybe we hear them less now, but also over the last 20 years I've been very aware that politicians and strategists, especially in Europe and North America, particularly in the US and Israel, became very mocking in their comments about the apparent passivity of the so-called Arab street. You know, the expression in the Arab world, the Arab street, the collective, the popular collective of resistance, in effect. And they become very mocking of it. I mean, it's quite, you only had to read, you know, over the years, the editorial comments of the New York Times, the Washington Post, that what's the response of the Arab street? Like to Gaza, for example. You don't see a response. Let's plough forward, let's back the Israelis. Again, a bit less of this now, and in a very fascinating issue of Foreign Affairs, which came out in the spring, one of the leading figures in Middle East studies in the US, an academic, authors an article which, the theme of which, how do we get it all so completely wrong? And he says, on behalf of American academics working in the field of Middle East studies, I said we were all completely wrong. And then there's this long mea culpa thing where they're trying to provide, you know, excuses. And it put me in mind exactly of the mood amongst the Middle East academics following the Iranian Revolution of 1979. In the case of the Iranian Revolution, after the fall of the Shah, the whole CIA office for the Middle East was sacked. You can't imagine the fury, maybe some of you can, who will remember the events, the fury of the American political establishment that their most important ally in the Middle East, alongside Israel, the Shah, had been deposed. But not only that, there was the humiliation of the Americans with the events of the American embassy in Tehran and so on. There was absolute fury that you know, the messages were flying around the Pentagon and the CIA networks. Who's this guy Khomeini? Why didn't anyone tell us about him? You know, where does he come from? The sort of ghost figure who'd emerged and was now haunting American foreign policy. And there was a time of settling accounts with American academics for not getting it right. And the same thing's going on again. You know, I mean, learning absolutely nothing about how far the imperialism can go and what the breakpoints are and how people respond. We're revisiting this whole episode. Anyway, when you hear demonstrators in US cities like Denver and Seattle and Tucson, I mean, when I saw the photographs of the demonstration in Tucson, I mean, this is the deepest deep of the deep south, citing Tahrir, Cairo, as their inspiration, you really know something's happening. So I think this is the context. It isn't the question of the making revolution in the Middle East is critical, but there's also this global dimension now, which is also, I think, part of our agenda. So, what can we as revolutionary Marxists contribute to understanding and advancing these movements, which I think are indisputably of world importance? I want to start the series, really, with some general comments, and then just open up debate. On top of any and all topics relating to the Arab Spring. Of course, we're free to speak pretty openly about these topics in London, and right now in Cairo or Tunis or various other cities of Egypt and Tunisia in particular, our friends can do the same. But of course, there are plenty of places where it isn't possible to speak openly about these events in the Middle East. I mean, if we were in Damascus, or Aleppo, or Tehran, or Tabriz, or countless other cities, or Baghdad, or Basra in Iraq, for example, or even Algiers, it isn't possible to speak in the same way. Because these questions, I've sort of headlined them as global political issues, but they're also questions of life and death. They are also questions of life and death. And if you're watching Al Jazeera, when those events were taken, you were a participant, it was a matter of life and death in Tahrir. And these were our friends fighting for their lives in Tahrir then. And so one can say, when our friends in Cairo and elsewhere speak of the martyrs of the revolution, they are talking about the blood which is let under these circumstances. And it's in this context that the making of political strategy isn't just about big ideas, it really is about the survival of movements and maintain the continuity of these movements and maintain the integrity of the people who are involved in them. So issues of, if you like, political theory and revolutionary strategy are of absolutely immediate, imminent significance. And I want to make a number of type of observations about the topics we've scheduled for discussion over the coming weeks. I want to identify a type of 4 topics. I'll keep it to 4 points, which I think are thematic issues for us. First of all, that revolutions in general, including the current upheavals, are not sudden episodes which open and close abruptly. They are processes, and they are invariably complex processes. I mean, when we look back historically, these processes are somehow compacted by time, but they are often complex and quite lengthy processes that need to be understood in detail with those with an interest in the outcome. If I take the example of the Iranian Revolution again, if you look into the history books, perhaps the more superficial ones, the Iranian Revolution was something that happened which produced the result in February 1979 of the fall of the Shah. But in fact, the movement, you can trace back the origins of any movement like this over decades, but the specific movements which led to the upheaval in Iran arguably began in 1976, and they can be traced through until at least 1982. And there were innumerable complex episodes in that movement. So revolutions are processes. Secondly, rather obvious point, but it's a rather important one, revolutions are about people whose engagement and whose direct collective interest is a key factor in shaping the events. So, in Marx's words, the engagement of people is indeed about making history. It's really about making history, both in the specific and in the wider sense. So, that our friends in Cairo or Tunis or elsewhere, they're not observing change passively or helplessly. Of course, in the case of the movement of Tahrir, helplessness is not the word which comes to mind. But they are active agents in shaping the revolutionary agenda from day to day. But there's another meaning of this question of engagement and human involvement in the events. I think it's very significant that from the earliest years of the 20th century in the Middle East, there's been a record of virtually continuous struggle, within which the working class has been a key participant. Now, much of the history of this region marginalises these struggles, particularly working class struggles, are hardly made visible. Now, there are reasons for that. This is one very important reason why our next meeting in this series is going to be about the revolutionary, about the traditional struggle, particularly workers' struggles, and we'll be looking at those in detail. But there's been this type of continuous engagement in the process of change. At the same time, so there's this wider sense of engagement, but then there's this immediacy which I want to come back to and emphasise, because I suspect, as we meet over the weeks, events we're going to be seeing, for example, think about Egypt again, we're going to see the Egyptian elections. We're going to see a very highly charged situation in Egypt, in which a very unstable regime will be attempting to direct affairs as best as it can, while millions of people will be attempting, as they see it, to seize their first opportunity to express their views relatively freely. So there's going to be a whole series of episodes in which these various forces are matching up. And what activists in particular, what socialist activists do under these circumstances is absolutely crucial. Third point I want to make is that revolutions take place in specific historical circumstances which influence the activity, the engagement I've just described. And I think three political currents are extremely important for us here that we'll also be examining in this series. They've had a decisive influence on mass movements and revolutionary episodes across the Middle East. The first is the Arab nationalist tradition. A tradition that was part of the anti-colonial movements of the mid-20th century, in which mainly military men, and always men, I should say here, attempted to gain control over independent states, mainly military figures, hence Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, and so on. These people sometimes represented the aspirations and energies of the anti-colonial movement. They often made radical claims and sometimes carried through certain sorts of reforms. But each and every one of these currents produced local capitalisms, local state capitalisms, in which the military men and the bureaucrats were the main beneficiaries from authoritarian and often extremely violent rule. There's a host of states from Algeria, across North Africa, through Egypt and Syria and Iraq, of course, it's developed in this way. And the legacy has remained, and the legacy remains an important influence there's a historical record, and there's the impact on activists today. This is a very important consideration for us, and this is why we'll be having a session on the Arab nationalist movement and the left. There's a second current. The first current, Arab nationalist current. Second critical current we need to think about, the communist, or more accurately, the Stalinist tradition. Now, one of the distinguishing things about the Middle East, which isn't true of the whole of the global south, is that each and every one of the historic communist parties of the Arab world emerged after the degeneration of the Russian Revolution and the seizure of the Communist Party there in Russia by the bureaucratic ruling class of what became the Soviet Union. And put in shorthand, from the mid-1920s, Moscow exerted immense influence over activists, radical activists, people who saw themselves as communists, across the whole of the Middle East. That's something we're going to talk about in detail as well, because today's left, what should I call it, old left, has been profoundly influenced by a tradition in which the communist parties, by the 1940s and 50s, were becoming part of local ruling classes, or at least aspiring to become part of it, so that very often, in a sense, they fused with the Arab nationalists, often with disastrous results. By the 1960s, for example, when the Iraqi Communist Party attempted to join the ruling Ba'ath Party in Iraq, there was tragedy on an enormous scale. I won't go into the detail now. And we need to be able to account for these developments. In particular, people engaged in revolutionary activity day by day need urgently to have clarity about this aspect of the communist tradition. Because until today, the old left has played a role which inhibits mass struggles and that derails or even worse destroys them. So the Arab nationalist movement, the communist movement, thirdly of course the Islamist movement. Not unique to the Middle East, but originating in the Middle East and with an inconsistent but very important influence across the region. A contradictory movement, one with a conservative ideological core, but often with big memberships involved in various movements. I mean, the one which will come most readily to people's minds, I think, quite understandably, would be the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, receiving an enormous amount of attention now. And again, I mean, it's just fascinating way the focus on these. Here we are again, suddenly a lengthy article about the Muslim Brotherhood. I guarantee there's never been one in this magazine before. So suddenly coming into focus. In my opinion, the Islamist movement, owing much of its prominence in recent period to the repeated failures of both the nationalists and the communists, the other currents that I referred to, although this is something we can debate. So each of these traditions having their impacts in the revolutionary crisis of the Arab states. And as I say, it's absolutely crucial to understand them, not merely where the struggle is at its highest at the moment, but elsewhere. In Syria and Palestine, for example. I haven't mentioned Palestine so far, but it's of great significance. Only two more things I want to say, Samaya, before I draw these to a close. I said I mentioned 4 points, and I want to mention one more, which issue which is a thematic matter for us. And that is that for revolutions to bring radical change, i.e. far-reaching change, they require self-conscious political organisation, and that means political parties. Now, parties, or at least certain sorts of parties, understandably, have a rather poor reputation worldwide. And especially in the Middle East, where they've been associated directly with regimes. One-party rule. The National Democratic Party of Egypt. The Democratic Constitutional Rally of Tunisia. The Ba'ath Party in its various manifestations in Syria and Iraq. The idea of parties being an answer seems, counterintuitive at best. I mean, it seems bizarre to some people. But of course, I'm referring to revolutionary parties, organisations of activists who are with and for the revolutionary movement and have the coordination to resist counter-revolutionary initiatives and to take forward the struggle for power. Now, what's happening in Egypt at the moment is that the discussion about the need for such a party is becoming very pressing. It's becoming starkly obvious. And as we advance into, I mean, just looking at the Egyptian press today, if you follow these things, there have been 2 big electoral blocks which have been formed in recent weeks in order to find some type of working arrangement amongst major parties. This is the first relatively free Egyptian election in Egyptian history. And so the parties have been jostling and trying to occupy the space which would give them the greatest advantage. And 2 big electoral blocks were established some months ago. Both of them, but one in particular, at the centre of which was the Muslim Brotherhood, is collapsing. Parties are defecting, they're fighting one another. There's a type of chaos as we approach the election proper. And it's in these circumstances that some type of clarity about political organisation, but not just any political organisation, not political organisation just directed towards votes. And one of the developments in the last 2-3 days, I think, is that organisations, political organisations, which many of us in this room would have a lot in common, on the left, on the far left in Egypt, are dissociating themselves now from the election and the electoral chaos. I've just learned from Anne that the Democratic Workers' Party, which is an important initiative in Egypt, has resolved to boycott the election. And they're not the first. So what sort of a party, with what type of purpose, what type of membership? So of made these various points, one concluding point is that we need such forms of organisation. But in the light of the confusions and disorientations of the past, how do we take that project forward? Okay, well, you'll see from the sessions we've organised, I think everyone will have seen one of the programmes, that over the course of the next few weeks, we've created space to discuss all these issues, but there are two things that I haven't mentioned so far, which I'll conclude by mentioning. Really, little of any of certainly what I've said, well, if some of what I've said makes sense, little will make sense in the broader context without examining the role of imperialism in the region. And the record of imperialism, past and present, is absolutely crucial. And of course, we're dealing with that in a couple of weeks' time. And then there's a related and critical question of Palestine, which a lot of people in the mainstream journalists and academics, really can't have difficulty identifying the relationship between the upheavals in the region and the question of Palestine, which is in turn, of course, as closely associated with the question of imperialism because of Israel and its relationship with the West. And so we have a specific space in order to look at how to unpack that question. Okay. Well, my very last remark is that I said at the beginning that I've waited almost 40 years since seeing President Sadat pass by to no great effect on the Egyptian population, to see his successor removed. And as I told you, I saw Egyptians turning their backs on Sadat. Well, something a bit different happened in January and February this year. You might call it a frontal assault. Many key slogans, but perhaps the most important, Irhab. He was to go, and of course he did go. And the movement which got rid of him was a movement led by our brothers and sisters. I mean that in the most specific way, that people who many of us know and have known for many years, in this case in Egypt, are people who played an absolutely integral role in the movement which removed the personal dictatorship of Mubarak, but now involved day and night in determining means of getting rid not just of the personal dictatorship, but of the dictatorship as a whole, and carrying forward a movement which, if it's suspended, if the Egyptian revolution is suspended or rolled back in a significant way, will have enormous consequences for the lives of very, very large numbers of people. And huge consequences for Egypt as a society, for the Middle East, and for the wider world, because it has become a key point of reference for resistance to the depredations of capitalism. So there's a huge amount at stake. There's an enormous audience in the Middle East, and actually, although we're not a very big group this evening, there's a very big audience of people that we're all in contact with in academic and local community contexts. And I think it's very important for those of us interested in these events to think these things through and take the inspiration of the Arab Spring to be our reference point for examining this agenda of making a revolution in the Middle East. So I'll stop there.